Welcome to Hard Talk. I'm Stephen Sacker. This year marks the 50th anniversary of one of the most remarkable feats of exploration in the history of humankind, the Apollo 11 mission, which landed men on the moon. I'm in Florida to meet one of the crew members. While Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin were setting foot on the moon's surface, Michael Collins was piloting the command module which got them all home. So 50 years on, how does he reflect on the significance of that extraordinary mission? Michael Collins, welcome to Hard Talk.
Thank you very much, Stephen.
This year marks the 50th anniversary of the historic Apollo 11 mission, which you were a key part of. It means the spotlight is back on that mission, it's back on you. How do you feel about that?
There were three of us, of course, on that flight, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and I. Three very lucky people. Neil Armstrong was born in 1930, Buzz Aldrin 1930, Mike Collins 1930. Three quite different people. Neil Armstrong didn't like the spotlight. Buzz Aldrin does like the spotlight. Mike Collins doesn't like, with all due respect, sir, Mike Collins doesn't like the spotlight either.
And yet, here we are, and we're going to talk about what happened in 1969. Do you talk about it with an enduring sense of pride?
Oh, very much so. I mean, I was very proud of the job that the three of us did getting us to and from the moon. That trip is a very long and fragile daisy chain, and the links are very fragile, and we were able to keep them all intact, do our jobs properly. But more than the three of us, there were almost 400,000 Americans working on Project Apollo, and I thank them. They're the ones who don't get recognized.
I want to take you back, actually quite some time before the mission, before those amazing pictures of the footsteps on the moon. I want to take you back to John F. Kennedy pledging to invest whatever it took to get American men onto the moon in 1961, I guess. And within the decade, he said, we will make it happen.
Absolutely.
Now, did you, at the time when he said that, did you think, that's me, I am going to do whatever I can to be part of that?
No, I did not. When John F. Kennedy made that famous speech, a man on the moon by the end of the decade, I was struggling with equations of motion in the test pilot school at Edwards Air Force Base, and the notion of flying to the moon was far beyond my ken. Once I did join the space program and become part of Apollo, as the months went by, I thanked John F. Kennedy more and more, because the stark simplicity of his mandate was wonderful for us. We could quote John Kennedy, and we could get things done. We could accelerate people. We tell people we've got to have this by day after tomorrow. The Kennedy mandate, the simplicity of it, the stark beauty of it, really helped us along to the moon.
Did you feel that you were part of some sort of Cold War contest? Because we shouldn't forget that Kennedy's commitment was, in part at least, driven by a preoccupation with what the Soviets were doing, and the sense that the Soviets may be getting ahead of America in the space race. This was America's determination to fight back. Did you feel like a cold warrior, in a sense?
Yes, a little bit. We of course, were acutely aware of the USSR. We knew that we were in a competition with them, but somehow that was behind a scrim, behind a screen. It wasn't part of our day-to-day life. I didn't feel like an active competitor. My problems were American problems, trying to get American problems solved. And although we knew we were in this competition, at least my consciousness was 99% taken with non-Soviet affairs or status.
You were picked, ultimately, for this Apollo 11 mission, alongside, as you say, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin. You then spent time training with them, you did the mission with them. It was a feat of enormous ambition and daring. And I just wonder what sort of bonds you forged with those two men, Armstrong and Aldrin.
We formed some very strong bonds, but actually not really during the flight of Apollo 11 or even during the preparatory flight of the flight. It was an around the world trip that we took after the flight. When I came to know Neil better, during our training, in the first place, we had not been a backup crew as most primary crews had been. So we just got to know each other in the 6 months before the flight, which is a short period of time. Further, we were split by function. Neil and Buzz were primarily off doing lunar module training. I was usually by myself doing command module training. So I, somewhere along the line, described us as amiable strangers. I didn't mean that in a derogatory way, but when we were very hardworking, when the day was over, we didn't party, we didn't drive color-coordinated Corvettes or any of that kind of thing. Our noses were to the grindstone. We had both come off the Gemini program, so we did have some experience in space. Gemini program was a fascinating but a much smaller program, and it had more of a local appeal or feeling about it, almost perhaps like an athletic contest of some sort. Apollo 11, on the other hand, was heavy-duty big business. We felt the weight of the world on our shoulders. We were being looked at and examined minutely. We were under a tight time schedule, and amiable strangers we were in a sense.
But there's something intensely human about the roles you had, because Armstrong and Aldrin, as you say, were committed to the landing. They were in the lunar module, and they were going to be the guys, let us be honest, who were going to get the glory of making those footsteps on the moon. You were integral to the mission, but you were piloting the command module. You were absolutely crucial to getting them onto the moon and getting them off the moon and back home. But you were not there. And it seems to me it takes a particular kind of man to be committed to the mission and you accept that you're not going to get the ultimate glory. Did you see it that way?
Well, no, I certainly thought that I did not have the best seat of the three on Apollo 11, but I can say in all honesty, I was thrilled with the seat that I did have. I knew that I had somehow lucked into being 1/3 of the team that was going to do this wonderful thing, and my function suited me fine. I mean, yeah, sure, I would have preferred to walk on the moon, but that really seemed trivial distinction at the time. I was very pleased with my responsibilities on the flight.
People have said that yours actually was the loneliest job that a human being could ever have, because while they went off, the two of them together in the module to make that landing, you were orbiting the moon in the command module, and for a substantial chunk of every orbit, you were completely isolated from all of humankind, because you were on the far side of the moon, out of all contact with humanity. No human being has ever been more isolated than you were.
So what?
So, what did you make of that experience? What kind of impact did it have upon you?
Well, when I returned to Earth, I was amazed because most of the questions to me from the press centered on, you were the loneliest man in the whole lonely orbit around the lonely planet on a lonely evening. And I felt, on the other hand, quite comfortable in my happy little home inside the command module, Columbia. I had been flying airplanes by myself for a number of years, so the fact I was aloft by myself was not anything new. I was very comfortable.
And yet, there was an awful responsibility on your shoulders, because you were the guy who had to make sure that Aldrin and Armstrong got back to the spacecraft that was going to get you all home. And you didn't know whether the lunar module would really work when it left the moon's surface. You didn't know if Armstrong and Aldrin would make it back to you. And I just wonder if in your mind you had a plan for what you'd do if things went wrong.
Well, first, you've hit upon the part of the flight that I worried about the most, which I thought that Neil and Buzz would go on down and have a successful landing. And a lot of our equipment was duplicated, but when it came to their return to me, they had one engine bell, one combustion chamber, and that had to work perfectly to lift them up back to my orbit. I had around my neck an 8x10 notebook, which had in it 18 different possibilities for how we would bring those two vehicles back together. If everything went according to the textbook, it was fairly simple and something that we had practiced over and over in the simulator.
Did you ever think what it would mean for you if you'd had to return to Earth without them?
Yeah, sure I did, but only in the most abbreviated form. I mean, at first I was not going to commit suicide. I was coming home by myself. I would be a marked man for the rest of my life. I knew that. And I didn't dwell on that, but I was quite aware of that fact.
Did you, as other astronauts have discussed, and of course back in 1969 there were very few men who'd had the experience that you were having of seeing our blue planet from space. Did you find it changed your view of humanity, of our place in the universe?
Yes, I believe it did. If there's any part of the flight of Apollo 11 that sticks in my memory, it is the memory of a little tiny thing that you can obscure with your thumbnail, blue and white, the white of clouds, the blue of the ocean, just a trace of land, gorgeous, very shiny, bright background, totally black. I will remember that all my life, and it leads one to consider, well, is it so pretty? Is it so quiet? Is it so pristine? For some reason, the word fragile came up out of the murk somehow. I know not how, but I thought, God, it's a fragile little thing, isn't it? And
well, in the 50 years since you had that special view of our planet, do you think we human beings have respected and understood that fragility?
No. No, I don't think so. When we flew to the moon, the population of the Earth was about 2 billion, and it's sneaking up now on 8 billion. And that growth is willy-nilly, without any consideration for the support that that additional number of people requires from the resources of the Earth. No, I don't think we ever consider that.
Let me ask you, if I may, a personal question about that return to Earth. You were perhaps at that time in 1969 the three most famous men on the planet. You had achieved something which men had dreamed about. I mean, mankind had dreamed about for so long, and you had delivered it. And yet afterwards, it cannot have been easy to handle both the adulation and the intense focus and spotlight upon you. Buzz Aldrin has been open about the difficulties he had in coming to terms with it. He said, I'd been to the moon, I had traveled around, but what on earth was I going to do next? Did you have a feeling like that too?
Not really. I bailed out of the space program before Apollo was over. I felt that the first lunar landing had fundamentally done what John F. Kennedy had asked us to do. I went on to other jobs. First I was Assistant Secretary of State. Later I was Director of the National Air and Space Museum.
Wait, and let me interrupt, because both of those extremely important jobs with a great deal of responsibility. But if you had stayed, I think most people who know NASA well think there's little doubt that you could have commanded your own Apollo mission. You may well have stood a chance in the years that came to have walked on the moon yourself. And you walked away from that possibility. Why?
Oh, a whole host of reasons, some of them professional, some of them personal. I think the personal ones at that time probably weighed more heavily on me than the professional ones. My wife, Pat, had put up with my ridiculous career, being a jet fighter pilot, a test pilot, this loony astronaut thing, whatever it was, and yeah, that required long hours, a lot of time away from home, and the time away from home frequently was you were stuffed into a simulator, and I was sick and tired of being stuffed into a simulator. And I felt that I had upheld my end of the bargain with NASA. I didn't feel like I owed NASA anything, nor did they owe me anything.
But any regrets at all that you did not pursue that opportunity?
Oh, sure. But my luck had endured, and this was time for it to end. And yeah, sure. But did I look back when Gene Cernan, my good friend Gene Cernan, stepped out onto the lunar surface? Did I feel a sense of green envy?
You didn't think that could have been me?
Yeah, I maybe thought that, but I wasn't, green with envy or anything like that. It was not a strong feeling. No, I made my decision. I was happy with my decision. I was now living in Washington, D.C. with a decent job. My wife, my family situation was good. So I had no cause for any great regret.
As you say, you for a while were director of the Air and Space Museum. You stayed very closely tied to the world of space exploration. You've watched NASA at close quarters. Do you think, after the Apollo program was wound up, do you think NASA, in a sense, lost its way? That for all of the development of the space shuttle, those endless missions to the space station, space lab, they seem to lose momentum with the notion of pushing forward with manned exploration. Do you think that they made a big mistake?
I don't think NASA lost its way so much as NASA lost its money. And there's an important distinction there. I think NASA sort of wobbled along. They weren't quite sure what you did. After Apollo, they did a space station, an abbreviated form of one, and then they created the shuttle. I think those were important and useful steps. They were not as dramatic. They didn't excite the American people, and interest in the space program decreased. But I think that was perhaps inevitable after Apollo was over.
Let's talk about Mars. You have always been a passionate advocate of the need for humans to push a mission to Mars, but there are so many challenges involved in a Mars mission. It would take so long, at least 2 years. Do you see a commitment, not least amongst America's politicians, to invest what it would need to get human beings to Mars?
The financing of space has changed somewhat in that it's not only a taxed government project, Mars, but some private money is being thrown in by people such as Elon Musk.
Are you comfortable with that? With the notion that America's richest billionaires, and you mentioned Elon Musk, we could talk about Jeff Bezos as well. Are you comfortable with a sort of climate in space exploration where they seem more committed to pushing the boundaries, the frontiers, than the US government?
No, well, I think the U.S. government should welcome their money in. Sure, if they want to throw in $1 billion here and $1 trillion there, well, bless them. I don't see that there's anything wrong with having. Once you're in a spacecraft, you're not sure who paid for the thing that you're up in. The fact is that you're there, and they're adding to the possible reality of a trip to Mars a little bit sooner than if you relied solely upon appropriated funds.
Isn't the truth, though, that if we, the human species, are serious about the next phase of space exploration, which will be mind-bogglingly expensive and technically extraordinarily challenging, it can really only happen if there is cooperation between all of the biggest powers, that is the United States, China, and Russia.
I think we have to find a way to cooperate. I remember so vividly the trip that the three of us took after the flight of Apollo 11, and we were surprised that everywhere we went, every city we visited, we were not greeted with, oh, well, you Americans finally did it. We were greeted with, we did it. We, humanity, we human beings have put ourselves, our talents together, and we have done it. And I think that we have to build on that spirit, which was ephemeral.
But Xi Jinping, the president of China, not so long ago, talked about China's space dream. We saw just a few months ago the Chinese, with a remarkably detailed technical achievement, putting a rover on the other side of the moon, something that hadn't been done before. I mean, there are people in Washington, D.C. extremely nervous about Chinese intentions in space. Do you think they've got a point?
Well, the Chinese, I think, certainly pose a problem. I think the fact that they landed on the backside of the moon is not an extraordinary technological achievement, but some of the things that they may learn there will be extraordinary. Some of the minerals, for example, that can be mined from the backside and brought back will be very, very valuable. And I think so we in the United States have to worry more about China as a competitor. How we overcome that, I don't know. I don't think we do it by increased tariffs. I think we have to somehow get the Chinese and the Russians who inhabit this little tiny fragile planet to join with us in friendly, not hostile space ventures.
And when history books come to be written maybe centuries from now, when we look back at the arc of human achievement over a very long time span, where do you think landing on the moon, putting men on the moon and seeing them walk on the moon will sit in terms of milestones achieved by our species?
I think two flights were very important, Apollo 8 and Apollo 11. Apollo 8, which didn't land on the moon, but was the first human vehicle to exceed escape velocity, was very important, perhaps as important as Apollo 11. Apollo 8 was about leaving. Apollo 11 was about arriving. 100 years from now, I'm not sure which historians would be prevalent in an argument whether it's more important that we left or more important that we arrived. I think both of those were monumental achievements, and they will be remembered as we proceed toward what I hope is Mars. And if we can leave for one and arrive with another, I think we can do the same thing. Although I may contradict myself and say that the first flight to Mars may be intentionally a one-way flight, so it would be leaving only and not well, leaving and arriving.
Mike Collins, I thank you very much for being on Hard Talk. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Stephen. BBC is my favorite.